The RotoViz Dynasty Reanimators are back in the hot seat. We are going to talk through our recent startup draft that is continuing with the RotoViz Overtime community on today's show. Shawn, I don't know if we can call this a RotoViz Reanimator series. That was what we obviously kicked off last season when we took over an Irvine team and went through the offseason, kind of putting some touches and moves on that for kind of rebuild or reanimating a roster. But we'll still use that. I think we're still going to use that. When we get to these Dynasty shows, we are going to call ourselves the Reanimators. We're going to talk through where we are now, because when we finished up on the last edition of this, we did go in a direction that maybe neither of us thought we were going in when we started the conversation, where in the 9th round, we were on the clock at 9:03, and we were looking at some offers to move back and so on and so forth. We had a couple of picks in that 9th round. We couldn't agree on a veteran wide receiver, and we ended up in this instance drafting Jalen Polk of the New England Patriots. And then we had other picks that were going to be available to us or on the opportunity to pick, which we'll talk in a moment. We did make a lot of moves, Shawn. We've continued to move back quite a bit throughout the draft. But to get people up to speed as to where we are in this particular setup, it is the RotoViz Triflex format. It's a $250 league that we are playing in. This one, we have 3 quarterbacks, which leaving the draft, you can only have 3 quarterbacks in this format. We have Jaden Daniels, Bryce Young, and Bo Nix. So we're going Young at quarterback. And then at tight end, we have Brock Bowers, Colm Kmet, wide receiver, Jackson Smith and Jordan Addison, Christian Watson, Jerry Jeudy, Jalen Polk. And Shawn, I will spoil it. We have added Marvin Mims to that group. We do also have Travis Etienne, Kenneth Walker, and 2 veteran running backs who I won't spoil as we talk our way through the rest of it. I'm not going to let people have time to guess who they may be, but we are in a situation where there were some outstanding values available on the board, and maybe this will lead us to a discussion as to when maybe to lean into the running back position and when to make some of those decisions on a team that has been, as I went through those names, very, very young in general. The running back position throughout the younger version of it, being the younger players and still being old, with Etienne, and Chase Brown. Not old, but more senior than our other crew. And then we have 2 more veterans that we added in after that. So this has been fun, Shawn, but we've continued to move back. We are going to talk through it. How are you feeling about the roster in general before we start to break down the moves and what we need to do to, rather than just have this be a team that may compete in 2025, turning it into a team that has a legitimate chance to win in 2024?
Colm, it's been just, again, so much fun to do this draft. And I want to thank the OT community so much. One of the things that's been interesting is to watch all of the different teams pursue different approaches, but coherent approaches to allow them to draft and trade in such a way that they can fulfill their objectives, with the objectives sometimes having different timelines, but obviously with the overall objective of eventually winning the league. I don't think it's a huge surprise that as we got into the middle portion of the draft, maybe say this round 5 through round 8 range, that many of the managers were still wanting to generally attack youth. And that's certainly the way that we recommend approaching it. Colm, you and I took the very entertaining, somewhat controversial approach of relentlessly trading down, and yet at the same time also trading our future first-round pick. One of the things this has allowed us to do, obviously, is to have a lot of picks in a range that doesn't include the highest value players, but does include people who are either A, young and potentially rising, or B, guys who are going to contribute this season. And when you have a lot of picks, one of the things that you can do is you can build sort of a hybrid approach where you get a lot of youth, you have a lot of players who will either be with your team for a long time, or they're going to be rising in trade value, and then you can move them at a profit. Simultaneously, you have the flexibility to add in some veterans. One of the things that tends to happen if you go very aggressively to foundation players, maybe trading up, trading future picks you get the foundation guys and then you wait and then you attack veteran values later, that can end up with a super team as well, but it's going to be a team that is a little bit more fragile and injuries can really hurt you. The half of your team that is veteran can get old in a hurry. You're faced then with the challenge of sort of reloading it as opposed to rebuilding it. When you have foundation players that you paid a lot for, you don't ever want to really get into that rebuilding phase. You want to be able to reload, but you've also traded future value in order to get those really high-end foundation players. And so where do you get the assets from in order to do the reloading part of it? So those are some of the tensions. It's not that there's a right or a wrong necessarily, but we can see what the trade-offs are as we go through and start to build our teams. The other thing that's really interesting is that when you're doing these drafts with a co-manager, you're going to often disagree about exactly who to target, which Colm has been the case for us, even though obviously we do the show together. We do a lot of drafts together. We're very tight on players, and yet there are still going to be some differences. So as we moved through round 9 and then into 10, there were a couple of times that we were on the clock sort of, 4, 5, 6 Pacific, so a little bit later than that, Eastern, but where there's going to be a long time period before you're awake again. And I'm like, Colm, I couldn't really agree on these picks. I don't want to just go ahead and take my guy. I'm
there's
not
also
even 100%
sometimes where
sure
I've
who
noticed
Colm's
where
guy is.
There's
And
also
so,
sometimes where I see, me and Colm don't agree on this guy too much, and it's like I wake up and we have one pick made. Sometimes Shawn will sneak those picks in. We generally do agree.
So just even the time frame differences, the time zone differences have led to a handful of trade backs where I'm just like, I got to buy some time. So we'll move back a couple of picks and hopefully the people will still be there. As a result, we have made 17 trades in this startup. I detail those 17 trades on the site. I encourage folks to check that out, kind of working through both what we were trying to accomplish, but also the other side of it, what our league mates were trying to accomplish, what the trade partner was trying to accomplish, and how if you help that person accomplish their goals, they're more likely to trade with you, and you're more likely to be able to get this volume of trades that allows you to accomplish the big picture objectives. Now, in this particular draft, obviously, when you are in a community and interacting with friends, it's going to be easier to pull off some of those trades than if it's a group of strangers. But the same basic principles apply, which is that if you are a good trade partner and you help the other side accomplish their objectives, trades get done. If you're not willing to do that, if you have to, quote, win the trade, then, you may win a couple of trades over the course of a season, and maybe those trades are so lopsided in your favor that it skews the league, in your direction. That's not necessarily the way that we like to approach it. But Colm, round 9, we picked Polk. The next player off the board, Josh Jacobs. His ADP, just in general in this format, is at the 709. So we can see how that is a round and a half value. The next pick, which we traded out of, the 905, is David Njoku. His startup ADP in the middle of round 8, that's going to be a value. A pick that we were hoping would slide to us at the 906, Jalen Warren. The startup ADP there is a little bit lower. That one's in the middle of round 10. So you can see how some of the players who maybe values that don't fit the OT brand or approach as much, we're going to fall. Some of the players that we would have targeted, and a lot of players in the community would have targeted, are going to rise a little bit. The one that I think was pretty controversial, a name that you and I were looking at and we had debated and you had kind of pushed me on, and interesting as well, because we recently got a trade offer of Ricky Pearsall for Evan Ingram, who is on our Reanimators team. Yeah. And we did decline that. Pearsall goes early in round 8. Ingram goes middle of round 9. Colm, I was a little bit reluctant to go after Ingram because of the age and the other players who are still available. We did select Kmet not too long after. Kmet has gotten a little bit controversial in the last week. We talked about that a little bit and said we're not particularly concerned. You get about a 5-year age difference with Kmet and a guy who really appeared to be breaking out in that 2023 season. He's going to be attached for the long term, we expect, to a Caleb Williams. As the last week has transpired, as these things have evolved, do you feel like it was a mistake for us to move out of the pick in the 905 that would have allowed us to get Evan Ingram? How comfortable are you with Cole Kmet? And then also there was a little bit of controversy there because we made a misselection.
Shawn, we certainly did. It was quite dramatic. I'll fill you in even a little bit more on this. I went to the cinema with my wife. We don't go out on dates all that often with a 6-year-old, but we went out together. We went to see Deadpool versus Wolverine, and I was walking around a store after that movie had finished, and somehow I put the phone in my pocket and I kind of clicked. No, is it you hear of butt dials? It was kind of like a butt click that ended up getting us Rachaad White at that spot. So we did have to do some backtracking to get the pick undone and to make the Cole Kmet selection then. So there was a lot of drama for that little portion of time as we took Kmet at the 10:03. But for a while, Rachaad White was on this roster. We'll see which of those ends up being more valuable throughout this season. But he did go one pick after then, Rachaad White, at the 5:04. So it was in that range. Shawn, in terms of the Cole Kmet stuff, I think, again, when we're in the preseason or the offseason, sometimes, as we've seen, even like we're recording this during the week, but earlier this week we see the situation with the Giants where it looks like, Tyrone Tracy is, out for the season, really serious injury, and then it comes out, within 6 or 7 hours that seems like an ankle sprain and that he's going to miss some time, but he's, has avoided the worst case scenario that it certainly looked like. But we're seeing this over and over. I think it was last week or the week before, I did a rant about how we I guess digest the information that's available now on social media with the ease that it can be spread at. So the part I mentioned that with the Cole Kmet side of things is we are in situations now where some players are playing more snaps with the starters, some players are in with the second team. There's a variety of things. Some starters are so far advanced that they're not going to play at all in preseason. Sometimes it's just a case of getting people out there. So all these people have different scenarios. Obviously, we would like, if Cole Kmet is active, that he's involved in all the plays, but there are scenarios where there's various reasons for what could happen. So I'm not overly concerned. And then when it gets to dynasty value, I'm not concerned that, over the course of the next 12 months that his dynasty value is going to be crushed by his tight end competition with the Chicago Bears. So I can see Shawn has a smile on his face. I think that he might be in slight agreement. But we are in a situation where we could have taken Evan Ingram. I like the age discount on Cole Kmet. Just before Kmet went, 2 picks before that, Pat Freiermuth went, then Derrick Henry, then 2 picks after him, Luke Musgrave went. And Musgrave is somebody that I do like a lot. I also like his tight end partner in Green Bay. But Cole Kmet, I felt like with what we've seen so far in his career was the pick to make at that particular point. It is close for me between Kmet and Musgrave, though, as to who you would want to have the pick there at the 10:03. The player we skipped over, Shawn, we did talk a little bit about him on the previous show and the series here when we were talking about the potential picks. We talked through Jalen Warren and Chase Brown. We did draft Chase Brown at the 9:11 as well, so he came in as the running back. But yeah, I'm not overly concerned there about this situation. And we do have Brock Bowers, so we're also being aware that is a real high class prospect. But everyone in the NFL, sometimes it takes different lengths of time. Talking of different lengths of time with tight ends developing, Evan Ingram was one of those. David Njoku, who went 2 picks before Evan Ingram, one of those as well. So I think they're all in a range of outcomes of similar proportions, but the additional youth for the Kmet pick, and even with Freiermuth, Musgrave, Kmet, all a lot younger, obviously, than the 2 names that I mentioned there a moment ago. Since that, Shawn, Dallas Goedert was the only tight end drafted in the following 2 rounds, but somebody who was a target that I had discussed with you at a number of the picks we were hoping maybe even would get back to us in the 13th round. We're 3 picks away from our next selection, but Jatavion Sanders did go off the board, Shawn, somebody that we had talked about. So since we made the Cole Kmet pick, Luke Musgrave was drafted, Dallas Goedert was drafted, and now in the 13th round, Jatavian Sanders was drafted, but it does also show that there is a little bit of not a little bit, there's a cliff there at the tight end position. So we did want to get one of those guys at the 10:03. So I'm happy with the Colm Kmet pick. Any regrets on that pick? And what was also your immediate thought when you seen Colm has drafted Rachaad White? Did you think I had been kidnapped? What do you think happened there?
Well, the first thing I thought was Rachaad White's going to be a hard player to get back off of the team. I was thinking we could offer him in a straight up trade for anybody who wanted to take him in the next 10 selections. The funny thing is he does go in the next pick. The reason he was the butt dial pick, as you mentioned, is he was the best player available by ADP. It's certainly possible that he consolidates touches this year and ends up as just a huge smash, right? We've been talking a little bit about where the ADPs are. Rachaad White's Dynasty startup ADP is in the middle of round 7. He goes here early in 10. The drafter selecting him had done a really nice job of building QB and wide receiver depth. So that is their first running back. Since then, they've added Blake Corum and Tony Pollard. That's a 3 running back group that has some interesting paths and certainly different profiles. So you like the way that they've done that. Tony Pollard in round 12, a fantastic value if what we saw in just the tiny window in the preseason game, if that gives you a good feel for what he's going to produce, not only this year, but for the next couple of years. Colm, the guy that we were hoping would come back to us later in round 10 was Tyjae Spears. It was a difficult choice for us between Chase Brown and Spears. Yep. Spears is probably, I wouldn't say probably, he's more established at the NFL level. He had a fantastic rookie year last year. He also looked really good in that Tennessee Titans preseason game. For us, the tiebreaker was that the Bengals offense looks like it's going to be a lot better. There's the other element where, even though we've had some skepticism about Tony Pollard because he failed last year as the starter for the Dallas Cowboys, Tony Pollard has been electric at the NFL level. And Zach Moss is one of these guys who's a tackle breaker. That has value. There's some stickiness to it as a stat. It's something that the NFL coaches obviously like. You see your guy run at the line, go down at first contact versus a guy who's fighting and picks up that extra yard. The extra yard versus an extra 80 yards when your other player can take it the whole distance, those two things are very different in terms of what they give you. But from a coaching perspective, it's difficult not to like the guy who breaks tackles. Having said all of that, the other reason that we selected Chase Brown is we do think it will be easier for Chase Brown to become the clear starter over Zach Moss as compared to Spears becoming the clear starter over Tony Pollard. Those were some of the things we were wrestling with, but we would have loved to also get Spears on this roster.
Yeah, he was somebody we were hoping to get back, and we have been quite fortunate that we have got a lot of our targets so far, but it's a challenge in draft room because, normally you pull up the FFPC ADP for this type of startup and you'd be like, well, it'll kind of go in a certain direction based on ADP. There'll be some people moving around in different directions, but with, the drafters being part of the RotoViz community and, they've mentioned in the chat, for example, that they have, access to Shawn's rankings up on the site and they kind of know what direction we're going in. Shawn mentioned on the last edition of the Reanimator series that, people messaging this been like, yeah, you need to, trade up to get this pick off us to get your guy. So there's things like that going on against us. But Shawn, with all that being mixed up, we have ended up with 12 picks in the first 9 rounds we actually made. At different points, we had different amount of picks in those rounds, and we mentioned previously we traded out of the first round, we traded completely out of the 4th round. Then, Shawn, we did trade our first round pick, which we also talked about on that last Friday edition of the show. But that leads us to a situation where, as we move on into the draft and make our moves back and kind of switch things around with Tyjae Spears then not making it through to us, our next selection ended up being at the 11:05, which was Marvin Mims. Interestingly as well, Shawn, for us in that 11th round, we talked about, quarterback strategy on the last edition as well. And we took Bryce Young in the 7th round. There was kind of a tier break. It was a little bit flat. took him there. That meant we had 3 quarterbacks. You can't draft additional quarterbacks. You actually, when you're in the FFPC draft, it ends up that quarterbacks do not show up. But one of the things that was interesting before that Marvin Mims pick was there was a little bit of a wide receiver run. We got Keenan Allen, Troy Franklin, Jermaine Burton, Dontavian Wicks going off the board at the end of the 10th round. But thankfully for us in the 11th, Shawn, it went Swift, Baker Mayfield, Geno Smith, Michael Penix, and then we got Marvin Mims. So it allowed where it may not have been a case that we would have been able to get the player that we wanted or a target that we wanted. Quarterbacks being selected there was beneficial. We've seen 5 quarterbacks go off the board in that 11th round, with Matthew Stafford and Derek Carr going 11:08, 11:09. Then Aaron Rodgers went in the 12th round at the 12:03. But as we, before we get to, we'll talk about Mims, we'll also talk about the 2 running backs that we did just select very recently. With all the moves that we have made, that means that in the later portions of the draft, we have 2 picks in the 17th round, 2 picks in the 14th round, 3 picks coming up here in the 13th round, but no picks in the 15th, 16th, 18th, 19th, or 20th. But when we look to next year, we have moved that first round pick away. We now have 3 seconds, 2 thirds, 2 fourths, a 5th, 3 sixths, and a 7th. So there is a lot of draft capital there outside of that first that we have been able to acquire, which is interesting, to stockpile up and to see how the rest of the draft potentially goes. There might be some offers for some of those later picks if we want to, potentially move out completely to pick up some additional capital. But we did pick Marvin Mims. Shawn, Romeo Dobbs was a wide receiver who won 1 pick after that. Then there was no wide receivers taken onto Khalil Shakir in the mid-12th, which was, just around a round after that. We did see one of your kind of prime, I would say prime targets. We talked there about Rachaad White, but his running mate in Tampa, Bucky Irvine, he did go at the 11-11. So we did take Marvin Mims over him. Was there a consideration for you to take him over Mims? Was it more roster construction related, where we had the 3 running backs already? We kind of didn't have there's kind of a gap there then when we go to the next available picks that we're looking at for wide receiver. The board at that point had led to having a lot of running back values, both veteran and young players. So in that range after the Marvin Mims pick, we've seen Dobbs, we've seen the 2 quarterbacks that I mentioned, but it was Blake Corum, Dallas Goedert, Bucky Irvine, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, David Montgomery, Aaron Rodgers, Tony Pollard, Marshawn Lloyd, Khalil Shakir, Najee Harris before we picked again. So a lot of running backs in there. You kind of had to go for the wide receiver, I think, at that point if you wanted. And since we took 2 running backs we'll talk about in a moment, but Brian Robinson, Zamir White, Jalen McMillan, Mostert, Charbonnet, and then Sanders. So there's been very little wide receiver movement since our Mims selection. Was Irvine in consideration for you there? And then the other part is, I think Mims is very interesting heading into that second year. We liked him last offseason coming in as a rookie. We see some very, very positive, spectacular, highlight plays on very limited usage last season at the start, and then kind of disappears. We're hoping that things work out, in the second season now. For example, Jerry Jeudy no longer there. Troy Franklin is obviously coming in. He does go after Franklin in this draft. I think the Mims situation is very interesting. And I think in the 11th round is a player who he could be a very valuable part of this wide receiver room.
Colm, there are about 4 really interesting pieces to unpack as we work through that. You mentioned Bucky Irving. He was the selection at 11-11. He was in this group with Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, and David Montgomery, who went in a 4-pick stretch. 3 of those players all to a single drafter who didn't have a running back to that point, but then suddenly had Mixon, Kamara, and Montgomery. And based on where those 3 guys are going in redraft, if you have built a team again with a really strong foundation, now you have 3 backs that will allow you to win in 2024. What we're seeing here is the whole wide receiver cliff element playing out in Dynasty in a similar way to how it plays out in best ball a lot of the time, where you've got to get your receivers. That was one of the reasons why we wanted to go ahead and get Mims where we did. He's interesting because his preseason game can be looked at in a wide variety of different ways, right? He's out there for the first play. He then more or less allows the veterans to get some run with the quarterback who is not going to be the starter. He goes back out. He's going to play a bunch with Bo Nix, but doesn't really flash other than scoring the touchdown. The touchdown play there was executed perfectly. A very simple play, and yet you love to see both ends of it there, where Mims gets open, he makes the catch, Nix is able to get the ball out instantly. That part, I think, very encouraging. You would have loved to see him be able to command the type of targets that their late round pick did. That's the part that is controversial, both with him and with Troy Franklin, who, as you mentioned, went earlier. I still think Franklin and Mims are going to do well. I still think that Franklin, who it was really hurt from a redraft perspective by this game, is going to be the guy, right? I think that Mims is the person who has to prove something now. I mean, he's already been with the team. If you come out of this second offseason and are not able to command targets, it's a problem. So I have some concern about him. I also have plenty of optimism. He's a guy, when you consider what he did in college, when you consider his age, when you consider where he was drafted, when you consider some of the splash plays he's made at the NFL level, and then the flip side of that, the amount that they've used him and his ability to actually draw targets. I mean, he could be anything from a star to an absolute bust. Mims, ultra wide range of outcomes there. But I do like having him on this team to go with guys like JSN, Addison, Watson, Judy, Polk. The receiver group is a lot of fun. Then Colm, the second kind of big thing there is how we work through moving in the draft. And we move down a lot. It's always tough when you move down and you see guys that you really wanted go. It's like we could have stayed and made those picks. Irving is a good example of that. Marshawn Lloyd, another interesting one. He probably falls a little bit in this draft because of an injury that by the time we're recording today, it looks like it's probably no big deal. Again, so anybody who is willing to take some of that injury risk, maybe you get a couple slots worth of value by doing it. You also take on the risk that the guy doesn't play that much and loses some trade value and maybe even loses portion of his career. One of the problems with the injuries is just that they're very real in terms of how they can damage a prospect.
I did mention, when that came up, we were talking offline, I believe it was, it's Dynasty, a hamstring injury that keeps him out for 4 weeks isn't going to affect his value. And he did fall a little bit, but, me saying that, it's easy to say when you're not clicking the draft button, but the part of that also is as a rookie, if you miss 4 weeks of preseason where you have a chance to be getting, some reps with the first team at this particular point, if you miss out on those and all of a sudden it's week 3 and you haven't really got a chance to play, your rookie season could be missed out and that value could drop as well. Sometimes the further down draft boards in the NFL draft that you go, sometimes those small windows of opportunity are all you have between being a starter or having a chance to start for multiple years or, falling out of the league. And, we kind of touched on some of the areas there you talked about with Mims where he kind of has to do it now. You can either be a star or a steady part of a team, or you could be a player then that like it's year 2 and it's over and you start to bounce around rosters for the rest of your time in the NFL. So it can be very detrimental, but I do think that in these dynasty startups, if you're looking at small injuries like that, it's still worth taking that risk on board.
So we think through some of the reasons that we did the trades. And the other piece to unpack there is that by the end of the 14th round, we're going to have made 21 picks. There are going to be occasions where if we had stayed, we would have gotten a better player. The flip side of that is that by moving down, you also exhibit some humility where, I think that Bucky Irving is going to be awesome, but he's got to accomplish some things that the back in front of him, a Rachaad White, who they didn't go in that dissimilar spots in this draft, is already set for and doesn't have to accomplish. And so if you're making the case that one player is going to be so much better that he flips that, then you want to get a decent price on it, right? And so we're going to continue to be disappointed when we miss and at the same time use that as a buffer against our own overconfidence. The two guys that I was really pushing you on as early as mid 10, mid 11, certainly the 11-12 turn, the guys that we were probably going to take if we had stayed were James Conner and Aaron Jones. Now, I say probably going to take because we had a group here of fairly similar veteran players that can work in a variety of ways. We think that Conner and Jones are much more talented than Joe Mixon, but Joe Mixon's ADP and his situation give him a very good situation from a floor perspective. Damian Pierce can use to look, even significantly worse. And if you're Joe Mixon, that's what you want, is a backup who can't play. And then you have a decent ceiling because you're playing there with the Houston Texans. So we weren't out on Mixon. Mixon was a guy we were considering. Certainly you have someone like a David Montgomery. He's an interesting player. He could score for you this year, maybe be on a different team in 2025 and still be young enough to do some things, because the guys that we ended up drafting are older than that. We were also looking a little bit at Najee Harris, who, again, from a pricing perspective and an age perspective, you're like, this guy could score this year. And then next year, if he continues to break tackles and have those peripherals, maybe he's a clear-cut starter somewhere and you score and then you benefit from a bump for the next season. Brian Robinson, an interesting back. Zamir White, someone who would be a value. The next couple of guys, Raheem Mostert. And then we love Zach Charbonnet, but he probably weren't going to draft him on this team, in part because of the Kenneth Walker. We just kind of want to spread our bets a little bit. I mean, there's some element where maybe you raise your floor by taking both guys. But so there was a very good group that we liked. That was also the reason we were willing to move back. Because if we lose the guys we really want in Conner and Jones, two players we think will be very good redraft pieces, there are other fallback options that maybe are even better, right? So we end up taking Conner and Jones. And one of the reasons we're able to do that is because we have so many picks. If those guys lose a lot of their value, either in season or in the 2025 off season, we can weather that because they're going to essentially be guys who are in that 15, 16, 17, maybe the 19th and 20th guys on our roster. Colm, as we think about the overall strategy for Dynasty, and then we drill down to some specific tactics, we're looking at this round 11, round 12 range as the right time to flip and start to go for some veteran targets if you've constructed your roster such that you have enough youth that those things are not actually going to be in tension.
I think that's a very interesting point. And I think when you're looking at when to do it, this is a situation where it makes sense at these prices, and they are, I think, discounted in this draft quite a bit, but we also have kind of the foundation backs, I guess we can call them that, or our hope is that. I know when we talked about Chase Brown, Shawn did point out, a little bit. Was it Chase Brown or Jill? I'm trying to think back to the last one. Give me 1 second. Chase Brown will be 25 as we enter into next season. So even at that point, he could be approaching some cliffs for the running back position. But we do get James Conner and Aaron Jones, two running backs who are now 29. And they, as you know, with Mother Nature, Shawn, they are not going to get any younger. I did look this up when we were, after we drafted them. They have combined in the NFL for 124 touchdowns. So they are good at getting in the end zone and scoring fantasy points. But we also, as you mentioned, have to be kind of humble and be understanding that might be a case that is obviously in the past, and that the future may look very, very different for both of those guys. But I think there's enough left in the tank from both of them to get production this year. And when we're looking at this roster and how we can have an impact this season, the additional running backs with that kind of caliber, I think, make it very interesting to draft them at that point. We also are in a situation where maybe they become a little bit more valuable even as the season starts. They could be potentially moved in season. We'll see how that plays out in this particular league. We talked probably a month or so back now about Christian McCaffrey in Dynasty, and he's a player, to keep 2-0. I think with the amount of picks we have in this draft and the amount of the cost of these two guys, you don't want to keep them to 0, but they are kind of players who may fit into that profile, with a couple of years usage here. But I think it's a lot more strategy, as the listeners, I'm sure, are thinking ahead as to what will happen with some of these veteran players on our roster. They may even move on before the season is over. But I like having both of those guys. And then when you mentioned getting them, in the 11th round, to be able to get them then in the 12th, I thought was interesting. The other player that I kind of would have pitched for there that you hinted at was Charbonnet if we hadn't had Kenneth Walker on this team. And the other name that I mentioned earlier, who is now gone, Jatavion Sanders, I think would have been interesting. But when we're looking at players who could help us win this season, I think they really do fit into that category to balance out the overall kind of projections for the roster in terms of like who scores more points this season, Marvin, Mims, or James Conner, or Aaron Jones. I think that's one of those running backs outscoring Mims most likely. So I think it fits into the overall build. So we are going to be up again in 3 picks, Shawn. So we'll talk about that maybe on a future edition. We have 4 picks coming up here in the next kind of 7 or 8, and then another one on the 14th. So we'll see what happens with that. But as we get ready to close this one out, any further thoughts on the draft so far, the team so far? It has been, as you mentioned at the start, a massive amount of fun to do it. We are also drafting in the FFPC Main Event this coming Sunday, so we'll have some content on that coming out next week. So make sure you are subscribed, because, Shawn, we as we do with this draft, we kind of like to put our money down on the players that we're backing this season. And when you're putting $2,000 down for the FFPC Main Event, that's exactly what you have to do with those picks. So people won't want to miss who we select in that particular draft. But any final thoughts here as we close out this edition?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention again this element of coherence and flexibility as you build your team. I had mentioned there were 3 or 4 things to unpack there. Some listeners might, well, it seemed like he only mentioned 2, maybe 2.5. The other element was the quarterbacks. And we had discussed on the previous show how Bryce Young was a difficult pick, but he also felt like the pick we had to make in that spot. The problem with it is that round 7 versus these 5 guys who go off in round 11, right? One of the reasons the running backs fall to us is because we get 5 QBs in round 11. And the name that really jumps out to me is Geno Smith. Smith in 11 versus Young in 7 is one of the reasons why I encourage people to hold their 3rd QB pick and get that value. At the same time, because we have the 3 young QBs and we have the overall depth, that's where a player like James Conner, a player like Aaron Jones can help you have some coverage of your running back spots, so the running backs who are the stars can fit into the super flex. Now, obviously, how exactly you put those guys in doesn't matter so much as the fact that you want to have scoring options that complement other things that you have done positionally and make sure you can get the absolute maximum number of points into the lineup. We've got a lot of young receivers on this team. If they don't come through, again, we may be in a situation where you play 5 running backs. And so having those running backs there, it's not redundant. It's trying to make sure that we can cover the different flexes and score a lot of points. Winning the flex has been something we've emphasized since the beginning. This is a way to do it in Dynasty and super flex and to use those veteran backs.
Yeah, and I do like the point on the Bryce Young versus Geno Smith. You would have got a 4-round discount between the 2 of those guys, and it was a flat area where we took Young, but if we could have moved out of that pick, that would probably be a better strategy to have for points in 2024. So again, another interesting one to watch how that plays out. That is going to close out this edition of RotoViz Overtime. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.